Top 3 places you can't go when people who win anyways, part 19 by Mrballen. What's good? How your day going? Morning, evening, night, whenever you're watching this video. I'm not gonna do a long intro. We're gonna jump right to the video. I already read the description. Yo, this number 1, the final story that we're gonna hear, Robot 23. Not gonna lie to you though, I am intrigued because when people work these type of jobs that we hear about a lot, we ain't gonna get into it right now, where it's like legit every day it's just effing danger. I never understood. I never understood how people could do it. But yo, people do it, man. Let's go and check out this video. You want to check out the original video? Link will be in the description below. But let's go.
Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice glass of sweet tea, but instead give them a glass of iced tea. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories.
Mute up. Sky.
In 2019, Robert Nishimoto was a 71-year-old retired professor of sociology from the University of Southern California. After his retirement, he had moved back home to Hawaii to spend his twilight years with friends and family. On Saturday, November 2nd of that year, Robert suddenly felt motivated to go out into his backyard and finally do a huge cleanup. His grass was fine, he took care of that, but the very back of his property was totally overgrown with bushes and shrubs, and the trees were totally long and had not been trimmed in some time. And so he figured he would just go back there and hack a bunch of it down. And so that morning, he rounded up all of his yard working tools and he headed out to the back of his property and he got to work. And all day, his neighbors saw him slowly making progress as he kind of hacked his way towards the back of his property. And by the evening that night, it looked like he was almost done. 2 days later, on Monday, Robert's friends were at their favorite restaurant in town waiting for Robert to show up for lunch. This was something they did all the time. But Robert was running late, so one of them texted Robert to ask where he was, but he didn't get a response. After waiting for almost an hour and a half, his friends grew concerned because Robert was not the type of guy to just blow off a lunch meeting and not tell anyone where he was. He was far more likely to be the guy that showed up early and then hounded the others about where they were. And so the friends decided they would just drive by Robert's property to make sure everything was okay. But when they pulled onto a street, they saw down the end of the road in front of Robert's house were fire trucks and police cars and tons of commotion. It would turn out nobody had seen or heard from Robert since 2 days earlier when he was out in his backyard doing that yard work. And when his family had tried to get in touch with him all weekend, they hadn't been able to. And so finally, on this Monday, right as the lunch friends are arriving at Robert's property, Robert's own family had called the police to do a welfare check on Robert. And what they discovered was horrifying. A police officer had gone up to Robert's front door and knocked. There was no answer, the door was locked. So the officer went around to the back of the house and knocked on the back door. Again, there was no answer, but the back door was open. And so the officer opened it up, he yelled for Robert, there was no answer. The officer stepped inside to just have a look around to make sure Robert was okay. And he went room by room and there was nothing in there. He's yelling out for Robert, there's no sign of him, there's no sign of a commotion or anything. And so he turns around and goes back out the back door into the yard, and he looks towards the back of the property and he sees there's some yard working tools that are just laying on the ground, and next to it looks like there's some sort of divot in the ground. And so it intrigued the officer, so he began walking across the yard towards these yard working tools and this divot. And as he got closer and closer to this divot, he saw there was a small hole in the center of this divot in the ground.
No.
And so the officer made it right up to the edge of this strange indentation on the ground, and he looked into this little hole, and then all of a sudden the ground kind of collapsed into itself, revealing a 2-foot wide hole where the small hole had been. The officer jumped back to keep from falling in, and after a few moments, he stood back up and he walked very cautiously to the edge of this hole, and he tried to shine his light down into it, but he couldn't see the bottom. It was obviously a very deep hole. And so he carefully moved forward, testing every step to ensure the ground was not going to erode underneath his foot. And then finally, he got right to the edge where he could shine his light all the way down to the bottom, 22 feet below, and there on the bottom was Robert's body. In cities, people are afraid of falling into manholes. In parts of Hawaii, people are afraid of falling into lava tubes. These tubes form during volcanic eruption. When the lava flow is flowing downstream, it begins to cool, and the exposed section of lava starts to harden and creates this sort of shell around the lava flow that's traveling underneath it. And that lava will continue to flow for months until it completely drains and leaves behind this hollowed out shell that makes this massive tube underground called a lava tube. And over time, nature just kind of reclaims the outside and inside of these lava tubes, giving the impression from the top looking down that it's just normal Earth with trees and plants growing on top of it, but really underneath it is this massive underground hollow tunnel. Robert fell through what is called a skylight, which is a small hole at the top of one of these lava tubes. Because Hawaii is known for having lava tubes all over the island, residents have to be aware of skylights when they're walking around the island. But luckily, in these high traffic areas, they're very easy to identify and nobody's scared about falling into them. But if you go off the beaten path on the island to areas that are not particularly well trafficked, like Robert's super overgrown back part of his property, you could run into an undiscovered skylight. And experts say those skylights are difficult to identify because a lot of times in these areas that are totally overgrown and off the beaten path, the grass and the brush have kind of grown over the hole, and so you wouldn't necessarily see it. It would look like solid ground when in reality it was a death trap.
It's like the more you know, the less you wish you actually knew, dog. I was like, man, if I ever take a trip to Hawaii, you know how scared I'm gonna be now, dog? Damn, rest in peace, dog. And you know what's crazy? Lately, I have a lot been thinking about this shit when I be in my car. I'm like, dog, what if I get right to this corner and then boom, a sinkhole happen? I can't stop thinking that shit. I be trying to stop. I can't stop, dog. Won't stop. Rockefeller, stop playing. Shit, I don't know, dog. I don't know if I call that one of places people can't go but win anyway. Is that one?
When in reality,
sound like a mistake, dog. No Limit Records.
Freediving is one of the most dangerous sports in the world, even though technically pretty much anybody who's ever swam before has then also free-dived, because all freediving is diving underwater without the use of a breathing apparatus like a scuba tank.
I'm a free diver.
But when people talk about freediving, they're not talking about the kids down at the local swim club. They're talking about those crazy people that go out into the middle of the ocean, take huge gulps of air, and then dive down to unbelievable depths and stay down there for several minutes before returning to the surface. And within this already extreme sport,
not gonna lie, it's a dope looking picture. I ain't gonna lie to you, dog.
Down there for several minutes before returning to the surface. And within this already extreme sport, there's an even more extreme version of it called no limits. Instead of the diver taking that big gulp of air on the surface and then turning around and finning themselves down to depth or pulling themselves down on a weighted rope, in no limits freediving, the divers are allowed to use whatever they want to get as deep as they can possibly handle. Again, the only rule is you can't use a breathing apparatus. The most common no limits technique is to grab hold of this sled that is connected to this bottom weight.
Yes, I can't play. Shit.
Handle. Again, the only rule is you can't use a breathing apparatus. The most common no limits technique is to grab hold of this sled that is connected to this bottom weighted vertical cable, and the freediver holds onto that sled, it's released from the surface, and the sled rockets down to whatever their desired depth is, and the diver just holds on, and then once they reach the bottom, the diver then turns a switch which shoots air into this big balloon that's attached to the sled, and once the balloon is filled enough, it will pull the sled and the diver who's hanging onto it back up the cable, back up to the surface. Normally, a no limits free dive using this technique takes approximately 3 minutes start to finish. The reason no limits is considered a more extreme version of free diving is because it allows the divers to go to these extraordinary depths that they physically are not capable of getting to on their own. We're talking about over 100 meters below the surface. There's just no way a person can just kick themselves down there. You would need the sled. And then conversely, you would not be able to swim 100 meters back up to the surface before you drown. You would have to use that balloon. And so in no limits freediving, when you go down to these crazy depths, if your equipment fails, it's usually fatal. On October 12, 2002, 28-year-old Audrey Mestry was sitting on a floating platform off the coast of the Dominican Republic. The French native no limits diver was mentally preparing herself for what she was about to do.
Don't do it, girl.
Audrey was one of the best freedivers in the world. And this day, she was trying to become the best freediver in the world by breaking the world record for the deepest depth achieved by a no limits freediver, which was 170 meters. And that record was actually held by her husband, Pippin Ferreras. But as she sat on that platform, doubt must have crept into her mind, because storm clouds began to roll in, and in the world of no limits freediving, where so many things can go wrong, there's no reason to add in another risk factor like bad weather. It could affect the people on the surface that are trying to support you. It could affect the line that you're using to bring you down to depth. It's just an unnecessary risk. Also, Audrey was using a new piece of equipment. She had a slightly thinner cable that was going to bring her down to the bottom that her sled was attached to, but she didn't know if it would work for this deep of a dive.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Keep me with the original shit.
But she didn't know if it would work for this deep of a dive. And her husband, who was in charge of safety for this dive, had been criticized in the diving community for rushing this record attempt, that he hadn't done enough preparations. There weren't enough medical staff. There wasn't enough standby divers that were going to be on site or on shore at the time of this dive. And Audrey was aware of these criticisms because her husband was regularly criticized in the no limits freediving world, because 6 years earlier, he had had 2 separate people on staff die during different diving accidents, and people accused Pippin of being very reckless. But despite all of these red flags and reasons not to do this dive on this day, Audrey was really confident and wanted to do this, and so she signaled to her team that she was ready to start. She zipped up her yellow wetsuit and then checked her sensors and video camera she'd be using for the dive, and then she put on her fins. Meanwhile, her husband checked the balloon that was there to inflate and bring her back up to the surface. And because this piece of equipment was so crucial, Pippin insisted he was the only one that could touch it, even though normal procedure was that at least 2 other people would inspect the balloon before the no limits dive. But regardless, after Pippin inspected the balloon bag and determined it was good to go, he signaled to Audrey to tell her it was time to start. She slipped off the platform and waded her way over to the 200-pound sled that was going to take her the equivalent of 2 football fields below the surface. Just before Audrey gave the final go-ahead to actually release the sled and begin this dive, she did a procedure known as packing, where freedivers basically take a full breath of air in and then gulp down additional bits of oxygen to pack their lungs full. And then when Audrey was done with this process and was ready to go, she did give that final signal. They released the sled and she began rocketing down towards the bottom of the ocean. If all went to plan, she would be back on the surface in 3 minutes. Audrey's descent was going perfectly until she hit the 164-meter mark. Now, because of the bad weather on the surface and all the rough water, that new lightweight cable she had, it was too light. And so the waves caused it to sway, and down at 164 meters, that swaying caused kinks in the line itself. And so as the sled was coming down, it caught one of those kinks and stopped at the 164-meter mark. And so Audrey just had to sit there for 30 seconds until finally that kink straightened out and she was able to continue down past the record-setting mark of 170 meters. Now, that 30-second delay might not have mattered if everything else in the dive went perfectly, but unfortunately, it did not. Once Audrey had set the record by hitting 171 meters, her sled came to a stop. And now it was time for her to go back up to the surface. On the video, you can see Audrey begins following procedure, same as always. She reaches over and turns the valve that's supposed to inflate the balloon that's going to bring her back to the surface. But after she turns the switch, nothing happens. The balloon does not inflate. For a second, you can see a hint of panic in her body language as she's almost out of breath. She's already had that 30-second delay at the beginning, and she's pressing up against that 3-minute mark, and she needs to get to the surface right now. But she stays calm, she reaches over, and she turns the switch again to see if maybe she hadn't turned it all the way the first time. But again, nothing happens. At this point, a standby diver noticed the sled was not moving up when it should have been, and so he rushed over and jammed one of his extra hoses with extra air up into the balloon and tried to inflate it himself. But there wasn't enough air coming out of this tank for it to fully inflate, and so the sled began to move painfully slowly up in the water column. Now, you would think this standby diver, who did have all sorts of extra air, would just give the mouthpiece to Audrey to let her breathe on that. Forget the world record attempt, let's just save her life. But unfortunately, Audrey and the standby diver knew that because she was so deep, the pressure was so immense on her lungs that it actually constricted her lungs to the size of oranges, that if she took even a tiny gulp of air at depth, that air would expand so dramatically on the way up, it would kill her. And so all Audrey could do was cling onto the sled and very slowly ascend and try to hold her breath as long as she could, but she knew at some point she was going to drown. And the video shows her absolutely stoic, just riding that sled, knowing that that's about to happen. On the surface,
Oh
when the
my
3-minute mark
gosh.
came and went and Audrey did not surface, her husband immediately threw on scuba gear and leapt in to try to save her. And by the time he got down to her and brought her out of the water, she had been underwater without air for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. When she was put on the boat, she had a pulse, but there wasn't a doctor on standby to treat her right away, and Pippin had kept her underwater for a couple additional minutes, trying to resuscitate her underwater. Audrey was ultimately rushed to a hospital, where she was later pronounced dead. The cause of death was drowning. Some believe Pippin, her husband, had intentionally sabotaged her dive in order to kill her, but the official investigation determined her death was accidental.
Wow.
In 1993, after an exhaustive review of hundreds of sites around the
Oh
United
my
States,
gosh, let's go back, boy. Let me rewind this shit, go back.
accidental.
Damn, something told me roll up another before I got started. Actually, real quick, since it's down to a little bit, let me use my bong real quick. Rest in peace. I ain't gonna lie, man. The whole time looking at her face, I'm like, man, oh shit, no, this. I ain't gonna lie to you, dog. At some points when her picture was popping up, I was wondering as I was looking at her face, like, yo, what is really going on here? Because her face, it was saying one or two things, at least to me. It was like, all right, either I'm just really just trying to keep my composure and I'm not trying to overthink, not trying to worry, because it looked like she was really just zoned out, whatever. So I'm like, okay, maybe she just like don't want to panic and like, you know what I'm about to do is free diving, but this is the no limit version, whatever. So of course I'm aware that this is some dangerous shit. I was like, I'm either seeing that or I'm seeing, yo, somebody look like they don't want to do this, but they about to do this, whatever. That's what it was looking like. So I'm like, all right, I don't know. I'm gonna just let it play out, whatever. So we hear everyone was criticizing his work. So I'm like, maybe it was just people just not liking the way he do things, and maybe it's working out for him. But once I heard the 2 deaths, I was like, yeah, at that point, hell no. And then it was like the weather was trying to say, like, yo, don't do this shit. But not only that, we're doing it with a new thinner rope. I'm like, what the fuck is really going on here, dog? Blah. And of course, we would not be here if that was not going to be the outcome that I freaking knew was coming. So I was like, all right, hold up. I'm wondering if that chapter touched this, because when I saw the picture of them both in the water, I was like, that looked like a that chapter thumbnail. Like, dog, stop playing with me, dog. Oh my gosh, man. Rest in peace.
In 1993, after an exhaustive review of hundreds of sites around the United States, executives from the German car company Mercedes-Benz had finally come to their decision. Tuscaloosa, Alabama would become the site of the first ever passenger car assembly factory outside of Germany. This was a historic day, not just for Mercedes, but also for Alabama. At the time, the state had one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, and so residents of Alabama were hopeful this factory would create hundreds of new jobs. But what actually happened shattered their expectations. Immediately following this announcement by Mercedes that they were going to set up shop in Tuscaloosa, 3 other major automotive giants, Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, all announced that they too would be setting up shop in Alabama. And so these 4 major factories all came with jobs of their own, and each of these factories attracted dozens of other smaller factories that supplied the parts to put together these cars. And so all these smaller factories came with additional jobs. And so this one decision by Mercedes didn't just create hundreds of new jobs in Alabama. It created tens of thousands of new jobs all across the state. 2 years later, in 1995, a little girl named Regina Elsie was born just about an hour away from the Mercedes factory in Tuscaloosa. Growing up, the automotive manufacturing industry was a big part of her life. Her family worked in the factories, and as a kid, every day when she went outside, she would see dozens of these 18-wheelers come bombing down the road in front of her house, carrying car parts on their way to one of the many factories. Regina was a reserved and quiet kid. She loved to read, she was a good student, and she loved animals. She would take in stray animals, any animal she could find, she would bring it back home to her house, but her favorite animal was her dog, who she named Cow. She dreamed of becoming a pediatrician, and so after high school, she enrolled in a local community college on a federal grant with plans to eventually transfer out to Auburn University, where she would finish her degree and then hopefully go on to medical school. But while she was at the community college, she fell in love with a local boy named Dan, who she had actually gone to kindergarten with. And before long, the two were engaged to be married. The young couple wanted to move in together, but they didn't have enough money. Regina was a full-time student, so she didn't have an income, and Dan barely made minimum wage working as a shelf stalker at Walmart. The only way they could get their own place would be if Regina dropped out of school and got a job too. This was a difficult decision for Regina because she still wanted to be a pediatrician, but at the same time, she was really excited about her future with Dan, and so she thought, you know, I'm only 20 years old, I can always come back and get my education later and become a doctor later.
No, you can always come back and get. I don't know what's about to happen. My bad. I just got over being sick, dog. I don't know what's about to happen, dog. It may work out to be the best thing ever. And that is a possibility. But that's a very thin one. I'm just speaking of the situation in general. You know how we get in these little stupid-ass teenage relationships. It's a very thin one. Fuck that, dog. Follow your dream first. I kid you not. So many of my family members did the same thing. Drop out at an early age, go work at GM, retire from GM. Hey, they all still doing good right now. I ain't gonna lie to you, dog. But yeah, maybe not all of them.
Pediatrician, but at the same time, she was really excited about her future with Dan. And so she thought, you know, I'm only 20 years old. I can always come back and get my education later and become a doctor later. And so in January of 2016, she disenrolled from her classes and went out looking for a job. A month later, she landed a job as an assembly line worker at a car parts supplier factory where her stepfather and one of her sisters currently worked. It was called Asian USA, and they supplied parts to Hyundai and to Kia. Regina's mother told her that it was not a great place to work, that she had worked at 2 other similar auto parts supplier factories, and the pace and pressure was unbearable. Car part suppliers are known for being under intense pressure to reach their quotas every single day. Failure to do so, even by a slim margin, can lead to massive fines imposed on them by their customers, like in this case, Hyundai and Kia. This immense pressure on these suppliers often leads them to overwork their employees, like Regina. And the employees develop a sort of production at all costs mentality because they see their employer only cares about hitting their daily quota. And so employees will cut corners and skirt safety regulations to
My bad, last time. I was just thinking about that, dog, because it's pissing me off because the fact that they're just rushing trying to hurry up, like, man, if we ain't making sure this shit, in the damn slogan, safe bullshit, it ain't about safety. That's bullshit what they show you on the outside, but then what's really going on inside, dog. Not trying to get deep on you and shit, man. Look, but regardless, though, I'm like, what if someone possibly just happened to get one of these faulty effed up ones, dog? Oh, that's effed up, man. That would explain my damn Impala. I used to hate that one. I used to tick when I used to get in like. I'd be riding that, you be driving that more. Yo, it used to be some scary ass shit in that damn car, dog. And it wasn't like a stop where it's like, oh shit, the car cutting off. Oh, it's slowing down. Let me pull over. No, you just be riding that more, and it'll just like jump like this, whatever, and the steering wheel will lock, and the car will still be going like at the same rate. It'll slow down, but it'll take a minute. It'll be going at the same rate, and you going straight. It'll do it for like a good 5 seconds, but it feels like forever. Because it's happening. Every time it happened to me, dog, I got lucky as shit that it was never a car in front of me or never where, because I was in Arizona, so not a lot of shit is on mountains, whatever, dog. I was like, dog, I could have easily been just coming down a mountain, and that bitch could have just locked up, nigga, and I'm going wild. I jumped out that bitch. Stop playing me, dog. Oh, that's scary, dog. Damn, I hate hearing about quotas and jobs where it involve people risking people's life big time.
And the employees develop a sort of production at all costs mentality because they see their employer only cares about hitting their daily quota. And so employees will cut corners and skirt safety regulations to ensure they stay on their quota. But after Regina's mother approached her and told her about all these horrible things about the auto parts supplier factories, Regina said, I got bills to pay. She'd already moved into a house in southeastern Alabama near the Asian factory. She was living there with her fiance Dan and her beloved dog Cow. She had bought herself a brand new car, which she was very proud of, and she had found herself the perfect wedding dress that fit her just right, but it cost $4,000. And so Regina was not about to walk away from this job. She needed the money. When she first started at Asian, she was put on temporary status, which meant she only made $8.75 an hour. In order for her to make more money, she would need the company to shift her to full-time status, which came with a $1.75 per hour raise. Determined to show the company she was worthy of being shifted to that full-time status, Regina volunteered for 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. But by June of that year, after 6 months of this hellacious work schedule, Regina was over it. And she went to her parents' house, she laid on the couch, and she told them that she just couldn't do it anymore. And in fact, she was going to start looking for other work, preferably something she could do part-time so she could go back to school and continue to pursue her career as a pediatrician. And her family was relieved and excited to see her get her life back to normal. A few days later, on June 18th, Regina, who was still employed at Agen, was working the day shift at the factory. Her job that day was to oversee a robot that would weld on these metal pillars onto the front right and the front left of the car where the side view mirrors would attach to. This robot looked like a giant arm protruding from the ground, where at the end of the arm, where the hand would be, were two welding tips that stuck out about 4 inches each. The robot was surrounded by this huge chain link fence that was there specifically to keep the employees from getting too close to it while it was in operation. Regina would oversee this robot via a computer screen outside of that cage. At some point in the afternoon, as Regina is monitoring her computer, it comes across the screen that there is a stud fault on robot 23. Now, her robot was not robot 23, it was the robot adjacent to her station, but the person in charge of overlooking robot 23 was a part of her team, and her team had a daily quota to hit. And so having robot 23 down directly impacted Regina. And so Gina stepped away from her computer, she walked over to the outside of robot 23, she spoke to the team member, and they decided it was best to just call maintenance and have them come by and try to clear the fault. A security camera inside of the factory was aimed down at Regina and her coworkers as they stood outside of the metal cage around robot 23 waiting for maintenance. But after quite a while, maintenance still hadn't shown up, and it was obvious the team was getting very anxious. They know every second that robot was not operational, they were hurting their chances of reaching their quota, which the company would be very upset about because they'd be hit with a big fine. And so at some point, Regina just kind of says, screw it, I'm gonna fix the fault myself. And so she picks up a small tool that looks like a screwdriver, she opens up the cage to robot 23, and she steps inside and walks right for the stem of the robot. When she gets over to it, she has her back to the robot's arm that's behind her, and she begins doing something with her tool to the stem of the robot. And whatever she does, it works because the robotic arm behind her springs into life and immediately goes back into the action it had been trying to perform before it failed. And that action involved swinging back in Regina's direction. And when it did, those two 4-inch welding tips at the end of the robotic arm were driven directly into Regina's back, impaling her. Her coworkers saw it happen and hit the emergency shut-off switch, but it didn't power down the robot until after it had thrust Regina across the cage and pinned her up against the wall. And so with this robot now powered down, the welding tips were now run all the way through her upper back and pressed up against the wall. She was literally pinned to the wall like tacking up a piece of paper with 2 tacks in a cork board. She slouched over, but her eyes were wide open. She was conscious, but she didn't make a sound. Nobody knew how to release Regina from the robot's grasp. And so the team leader hopped on a forklift and sped across the factory floor towards the break room. He ran inside, he found a maintenance worker, and he dragged him out. They got on the forklift. The maintenance worker had to sit on the team leader's lap, and they sped back across the factory towards the Robot 23 cage. When they got there, they took this maintenance guy and basically thrust him into the cage and told him to get Regina out. But the maintenance worker didn't speak any English. He was terrified at what he was seeing Regina the way she was. He didn't really know how to fix the situation. Tempers were flaring, and before long, the maintenance worker just
Okay. Pete, what he said. Because first I was mad. No, I'm not. Yeah, he don't know how to fix that situation.
Any English. He was terrified at what he was seeing Regina the way she was. He didn't really know how to fix the situation. Tempers were flaring, and before long, the maintenance worker just got overwhelmed and ran away. When emergency crews finally arrived several minutes later, Regina was still pinned by this robot. She was conscious, her eyes were wide open, and she was still totally silent. And they were able to get her off. They sent her to a hospital, and then she was transported to a trauma center, but it was too late. The damage that had been done to her by getting impaled by this robot was just too extensive, and she died at the hospital. It would turn out Regina's company, Agen, had not properly trained her or any of her coworkers. Agen's policy was to hire people and as fast as possible, get them on the floor, helping them reach their quota. And so as a result, Regina and her team members had no idea about a so-called lockout procedure, where if you're gonna go inside one of these robots' cages, you need to make sure the power switch has been locked out, meaning it will not turn back on if you fix the fault that has caused your robot to stop. All Regina and her coworkers knew is that the most important thing is hitting your quota at the end of the day. And so that was the reason Regina went inside of the cage, and that was the reason Regina was killed. Agent ultimately pleaded guilty to not having properly trained Regina, leading to her death, and they paid the family $1.5 million. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comment.
That is so effed up in so many ways, all because I ain't gonna lie to you. Would it be in teamwork? Like I said earlier, yeah, I definitely could see me jumping in and help my teammate, because all I know is how this job teaches. It's only about the numbers. It's the quota we gotta hit. And look, definitely with her trying to get this raise, get this dress as well. So yeah, I would have helped my teammate. Not gonna lie to you, but I'm also not gonna lie to you. As far as going into that cage, nah, I wouldn't have done that part. And from what it sounded like, what he was explaining was that I'm gonna go back in here as I'm editing, but from what as he was going on, it sounded like they were able to do that. Like, so if something happened, you are able to go in and fix it. But the problem is we didn't properly train you on what to do when you go in there. Because from what I was taking from the beginning of the story was she decided to go in on herself, and only the maintenance man was supposed to be the one to go in there. But then as the story was going, the person explaining, like I just said, whatever, it sounded like, yeah, you could do it, but we just didn't train you good. But regardless, yeah, so either way, I'm gonna hear it again when I go back and hear the story. But yeah, regardless, yeah, I wouldn't have went into that cage. I'm sorry, I'm not about to fix that shit. But it was like, as it happened and I saw that picture, I was like, no fucking way this is happening right now. And the fact that she was not even saying nothing, that is even more petrifying to hear. Like, dog, the fact that we just looking at this person just in this position and we're not hearing shit, but we know this is effed up. I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy as hell. Damn, and that one really got to the point where it was feeling like, yo, it was just, it's written in stone. It legit felt like it was going according to movie plan, whatever. It was like, all right, got to her breaking point, was about to end this ish. I'm out of here, done. About to get my life back on the track that I was on originally, whatever, right? Like, nah. Right when you get ready to call the job quits, whatever, nope. It went a different direction. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get up out of here. Definitely rest in peace, man. Yo, go ahead and enjoy your day, morning, evening, night, whenever you're watching this video. But I'm out.